We were taught that thunder is just the sound of lightning heating the air, a quirk of physics, a footnote in a textbook. But before any textbook existed, before any human ear was there to hear it, the first sound the sky ever made was not an accident of expanding gas. It was a wingbeat. Now, let that thought settle. Let your shoulders fall, just slightly, away from your ears. There is nowhere else you need to be if it feels right. Let your eyes close now, or leave them open. Either way, you are already where you need to be. Picture, if you like, a vast and silent plain beneath a gray sky that has never yet released a single drop of rain. The air is heavy, charged with a moisture that has been waiting since the beginning of the world, waiting to fall, and somewhere above that stillness, high on a granite peak where stone meets the edge of heaven, a great bird folds its wings and waits. It has been waiting a long time. This story does not begin with a hero, and it does not end with a death. It begins with a silence that was broken by something immense and sacred, and it carries forward through every storm that has ever rolled across a summer sky. If you find comfort in these stories, you may return to this channel whenever you wish. There is no urgency. There is only the telling and the quiet and the sky. So let the silence carry you back. Back before the first cloud, back before the first drop ever touched the earth. Back to the stillness before the storm that struck before the first rain. Chapter 1. The Last Silence Before Creation. The world did not begin with a roar. It began with a silence so complete that even the wind held its breath. The plain stretched from horizon to horizon, a sea of silver-green grass that had never been touched by rain. Above it, the sky hung like a sheet of unbroken slate, smooth, gray, and utterly still. There were no clouds, because clouds had not yet been invented. There was only the waiting. The air was heavy with moisture that had nowhere to go. It had been gathering since the first dawn, suspended in the stillness like a question no one knew how to ask. Each blade of grass held a faint shimmer, a trembling droplet too light to fall. The world was not dry. It was full of water that had simply forgotten how to descend. And so it stayed, year upon silent year, pressed against the earth without ever touching it. If you had stood on that plain, you would have felt the weight of the sky on your shoulders, not as a burden, but as a presence. It was the kind of stillness that makes your own heartbeat sound too loud, as though you were disturbing something sacred. The silence was not empty. It was dense, layered, filled with the unspoken promise that something immense was about to happen. But nothing did. Not yet. The plain had no memory of rain, because rain had never existed. The rivers that would one day carve canyons through stone were still only a possibility, a dream the earth had not yet dreamed. There were no storms, no thunder, no flash of light across the heavens. There was only this, a world holding its breath, waiting for the first sound that would teach it what weather meant. Far beneath the grass, deep in the dark hollows where stone turned to fire, something stirred. It was not a thought, not a will, only a slow, coiling pressure that had been sleeping since before the sky was formed. The earth sometimes trembled, a faint vibration that ran through the roots of the grass like a shiver. Whatever lay below had not yet found a name, but it was beginning to wake. The plain did not know fear, because fear requires a past to draw from, but it knew tension. The grass bent slightly in a breeze that had no source, as if the world itself was leaning forward, straining to hear something that had not yet sounded. The moisture in the air seemed to thicken, each droplet pressing closer to the earth, held back by a membrane of silence that was growing thinner with every passing moment. To the west, where the plain began to fold into rolling hills, and the first dark shapes of mountains rose against the gray dome, something caught the light. It was not a cloud, and it was not a shadow. It was a spire, a single needle of granite that pushed through the surface of the world and climbed until its tip was lost in the low ceiling of the sky. It had stood there since the earth was young, and it had never known rain either. On that spire, almost invisible against the slate of the sky, a shape rested. It was vast and still, folded into itself, like a storm that had been compressed into a single point. Its edges were soft, blurred by the haze, but its mass was undeniable, a darkness deeper than the surrounding gray, a silhouette that made the mountain beneath it seem small. It had been there for as long as the silence had lasted, and it had not moved once. The shape was a bird, though no bird that has ever been seen by human eyes. Its wings were folded against its body, each feather the color of thunderheads and deep charcoal, traced with a faint silver edge that flickered now and then, not with flame, but with something quieter. Contained lightning slept along the curve of each wing, pulsing faintly, like the heartbeat of a world not yet born. And then, after an age of stillness that no calendar could measure, the bird opened its eyes. They were not the eyes of an animal. They were twin pools of electric blue, deep and calm, and in their depths swam the first flashes of lightning the world would ever see. The plain below felt the gaze like a shift in pressure. The moisture in the air trembled, and the silence began, very slowly, to crack. The light in the Thunderbird's eyes was not the light of dawn. Dawn came from the sun, and the sun was a distant, steady fire that had never needed to announce itself. This light came from within, a blue-white flicker that danced across the iris like heat lightning on a summer night. It was the first electric thing the world had ever seen, and it was looking down. You do not need to picture the wing unfolding in full. It is enough to know that the air began to stir, a slow, deep displacement of the stillness that had held the world in place since its first morning. The feathers shifted, and the sound they made was not yet thunder. It was the low, resonant creak of something ancient preparing to move for the first time. Across the plain, the grass felt the change. A ripple passed through the silver-green blades, not from any wind, but from a pressure that radiated outward from the mountain. The moisture suspended in the air, the countless droplets that had been waiting since the beginning, began to vibrate. They did not fall, but they trembled on the edge of falling, and the earth below sensed it. Deep in the darkness beneath the plain, the serpent felt it too. The coiling pressure that had been stirring in its sleep now tightened, a slow clench of muscle that ran through the bedrock like a shudder. The Thunderbird above and the serpent below had existed for the same span of silence, separated by stone and soil, unaware of each other. That separation was about to end. The mountain that held the granite spire had no name. No human tongue had yet spoken a single word. But if it had a feeling, it was the deep, patient endurance of stone that knows it has been chosen. The Thunderbird's talons rested on the rock, each one the length of 100 generations of grass, curved and dark as obsidian. They did not grip. They simply rested, as they always had, waiting for the moment when holding would become necessary. A single feather detached from the folded wing, drifting down through the heavy air. It was the size of a storm cloud, but weightless, and as it fell, it crackled faintly with the residue of that internal lightning. It spiraled past the granite spire, past the treeless slopes, and settled on the plain below. Where it touched the grass, the blades bent and held the shape of its passing, as if even the earth knew this was a thing to remember. The Thunderbird's gaze swept the horizon. There was no anger in it. Anger was a fire that had not yet been kindled in the heart of any living thing. There was only awareness, vast and complete. The recognition of a world that was whole but incomplete. The sky was too still. The moisture was too heavy. The thing below was too close to the surface. Everything was waiting for a correction that only the sky could give. The first movement was not a beat. It was a spreading, a slow extension of the wings outward, like the unfurling of a continent. Feather by feather, the darkness expanded until it covered the peak, then the mountain, then the foothills, until the plain below fell under a shadow deeper than any it had known. The gray dome of the sky was now split by a silhouette that stretched from horizon to horizon. The silence that followed was the deepest yet. Not the silence of waiting, but the silence of recognition. The pause that comes when something irreversible is about to occur. The moisture in the air stopped trembling and became perfectly still. The serpent below coiled tighter, a spring of muscle and darkness held in suspension. And the Thunderbird, wings fully extended across the roof of the world, held the moment like a note held in the throat of a singer before the first word is sung. Then the great chest of the bird rose. The feathers along the leading edge of each wing caught the first glint of a sun that had never seen a storm. The air, which had never been asked to move, gathered itself beneath the span of those wings. And somewhere in the deep machinery of the sky, the first thunder gathered not as sound, but as the promise of sound, coiled in the space between stillness and the stroke that would teach the world what weather meant. Chapter 2. The Voice That Shattered Silence. The first wingbeat did not strike the air. It struck the silence itself. The great wings spread across the entire arc of the heavens, descended with a motion too vast to follow, a slow, deliberate pulse that compressed the atmosphere beneath it, like a hand pressing down on the skin of a drum. And the drum sounded. It was not noise. It was the birth of noise. The sound rolled outward from the peak, a low, grinding resonance that traveled through the stone of the mountain and the roots of the grass and the hollow places beneath the earth. It was felt before it was heard, a vibration in the bedrock, a shudder in the soil. The plain, which had known only stillness, now knew something new. The first thunder had spoken, and the world had no word for it yet. As the wings rose again, the lightning came. It did not strike like a weapon. It simply emerged from the edges of the feathers, from the depths of the electric blue eyes, from the very core of the bird's immense chest. Sheets of pale blue-white radiance rippled across the sky, illuminating the Thunderbird from within, turning each feather into a filament of living light. For one suspended moment, the entire world was visible. The gray dome of the sky, which had hung smooth and unbroken since the first dawn, now rippled like the surface of a lake disturbed by a falling stone. Where the wingbeat had passed, the air folded into itself, creating troughs and crests of pressure that would one day be called wind. And where the lightning had flashed, the moisture that had waited since the beginning of the world began, very slowly, to move. The Thunderbird's body was no longer a silhouette. The internal lightning illuminated every contour, the vast keeled chest rising and falling with the rhythm of a living engine. The great falcon head lifted toward the heavens, the obsidian talons still resting on the granite spire, with the gentleness of a creature that had never needed to prove its power. He was terrible in the old sense of the word, awful, sacred, a presence that made the mountain beneath him feel like a grain of sand. The feathers along his back and shoulders caught the residual glow, revealing colors the world had never seen. Deep slate, thunderhead gray, and a blue so dark it was almost black, shot through with veins of silver that pulsed like arteries. His crest, swept back from his brow, was a crown of storm wind frozen in place, and his eyes, those twin pools of contained lightning, looked out across the plain with an expression that held no triumph, only the calm, ancient recognition of a task begun. A second wingbeat followed the first, and this time the thunder did not roll. It cracked. The sky split open along a seam of white light, and the sound that followed was sharp and percussive, a detonation that echoed off the mountains and returned as a fading growl. The plain below, still bent from the first wave of pressure, now trembled with a second. The silence that had governed the world since its creation was being torn apart, piece by piece, and replaced with the voice of the architect. You do not need to imagine the storm in all its fury. It is enough to know that the air began to move, not as wind, but as the breath of the bird, exhaled in great, slow currents that swept across the plain and stirred the grass into waves. Each blade, still heavy with suspended moisture, bent and rose and bent again, learning the rhythm of the wingbeats. The world was no longer still. It had begun to learn how to move. The lightning was not random. It traced the pathways of the Thunderbird's feathers, following the silver veins that ran through his plumage, like rivers of electricity. Each flash revealed a new detail: the fine, soft down beneath the flight feathers, the delicate curve of the wingtips, the way the light pooled in the hollow of his throat before spilling outward. He was not merely a bird that carried lightning. He was the thing that lightning had been waiting to become. And then, for a moment, he was still. The wings held steady at the apex of their rise, the great chest suspended between breaths, the lightning dimming to a faint, pulsing glow along his wing edges. The plain below had gone silent, the grass frozen mid-sway, the distant mountains holding their echoes. In that stillness, the Thunderbird looked down upon the world he had just awakened, and the world looked back, and nothing anywhere moved. It was the pause between the first note and the second, the silence, that teaches sound what it means to return. The second note, when it came, was deeper than the first. The wings descended again, slower now, as if the Thunderbird had learned something in that moment of stillness and was now teaching it to the sky. The thunder that followed was not a crack, but a long, rolling wave that traveled from horizon to horizon, gathering the echoes of the mountains and carrying them across the plain like a song. The earth beneath the grass hummed in response, a low, sympathetic vibration that rose through the roots and into the trembling blades. With each beat, the moisture in the air began to coalesce. The tiny droplets that had hung suspended since the beginning of the world now drifted toward one another, drawn by the pressure of the wingbeats, merging into larger and larger spheres. They did not fall, not yet, but they gathered into veils of mist that wrapped the Thunderbird's form, softening his edges, making him appear less like a creature of flesh and feather, and more like a storm that had learned to wear a body. Deep beneath the plain, in the dark hollows where stone turned to fire, the serpent uncoiled. The vibrations of the wingbeats had traveled downward through the bedrock, and the ancient pressure that had been stirring in its sleep now woke fully. A single, enormous eye, lidless and pale as a drowned moon, opened in the darkness. The serpent did not yet know what had disturbed it, but it felt the weight of the sky pressing down, and it did not like what it felt. The Thunderbird's eyes, still blazing with that calm electric blue, seemed to see through the stone itself. His gaze dropped from the horizon to the earth beneath his talons, and for the first time, his expression shifted. It was not anger. Anger was still a foreign language to any living thing. It was recognition. He had felt the serpent stir, and in that stirring he understood the purpose for which he had been called into being. He was not merely the voice of the sky. He was its guardian. The wingbeats found their rhythm not a frantic flurry, but a slow, deliberate cadence, like the breathing of a world that had just learned to inhale. Each downstroke sent a pulse of thunder rolling across the plain. Each upstroke drew the mist closer to the bird's body, condensing it into the first true clouds the world had ever seen. They were not the white, gentle clouds of a summer afternoon. They were dark and heavy, shot through with the silver veins of the lightning that still flickered along the Thunderbird's feathers. The first cloud to fully form detached itself from the bird's wing and drifted upward, a mass of charcoal and slate that spun slowly in the newly awakened air. Others followed, peeling away from the Thunderbird's body like children leaving the side of a parent. They spread across the sky, breaking the smooth gray dome into a mosaic of light and shadow. The sun, which had always shone through an unbroken ceiling of haze, now found gaps through which to pour its pale gold light. The world was learning to wear weather. You do not need to picture every cloud or trace every bolt of lightning. It is enough to know that the rhythm had been set, a pulse that would beat at the heart of the world for as long as the world endured. The Thunderbird's wings would rise and fall, and the thunder would roll, and the serpent would stir in its dark hollow, and the sky would answer with lightning. This was not a battle. It was a balance, and the Thunderbird was the fulcrum on which it rested. The plain below began to change. The grass, which had stood silver green and heavy with suspended moisture, now glistened with a fine, clinging mist, the first gift of the clouds. It was not rain, not yet, but it was the promise of rain. Tiny beads of water gathered on the tips of the blades, catching the fractured sunlight and scattering it into a million brief rainbows. The dry riverbeds, which had waited since the earth was young, now held a faint sheen of dampness in their deepest channels. The world was beginning, very slowly, to remember what water was for. The Thunderbird drew his wings inward, not folding them completely, but bringing them to rest at half span, their tips curving upward like the horns of a crescent moon. The lightning along his feathers dimmed to a soft, steady glow, and the thunder faded to a distant rumble that lingered at the edge of hearing. He had spoken the first word of the sky's language. He had set the rhythm that would govern all the storms to come. And now, in the quiet that followed, he settled into his watch, the eternal, patient vigilance that would define him for every age that followed. The world had changed. It had a voice now, and the voice was thunder. It had a light, and the light was lightning. It had a guardian, and the guardian was a bird whose wings spanned the horizon, and whose heartbeat echoed in the chest of every living thing that would ever stand beneath a darkening sky. The serpent below had felt the change and drawn back into its hollow, waiting. The plain above had tasted the first mist and leaned toward the clouds, and the Thunderbird, architect of the atmosphere, settled deeper onto his granite spire, patient as stone, ready for the long watch that would teach the world what a storm was truly for. Chapter 3. The Engine of All Storms. The Black Hills rose from the plain like a spine of the earth, dark with pine and ancient with granite, and at their highest peak, where the stone touched the ceiling of the sky, the Thunderbird kept his watch. The summit was never free of cloud. A permanent crown of thunderheads wrapped the spire, flickering with a soft, continuous lightning that never quite faded. No human would ever stand there. The air was too thin, the cold too sharp, and the presence too vast. The storms that rolled outward from that peak became the rhythm of the world. They came in cycles, days of heavy, building pressure, when the sky darkened and the grass bent low, followed by hours of fury, when the wind screamed and the lightning danced, and then the long, gentle exhale of rain that softened the earth and filled the dry riverbeds. The plain learned to endure them, and in enduring, learned to love them. The storms were not punishment. They were the breath of the guardian. The creatures of the plain came to read the signs the Thunderbird gave. A single flash on the western horizon, brief and contained, meant that he was hunting. His gaze turned downward, his attention on the serpent's dark stirrings. A long, low roll of thunder that rumbled for minutes without lightning meant that he slept, his wings folded, his dreams sending slow vibrations through the atmosphere. The bison learned to graze in peace during those rolling rumbles. The birds learned to fall silent when the flashes came, quick and sharp. When the Thunderbird rose from his spire to hunt, the sky became a weapon. His wings, still immense beyond any scale the world could offer, beat the air into submission, and the gales that swept across the plain flattened the grass for miles in every direction. The sound was not the rolling thunder of his rest, but a sharp, percussive crack that split the heavens and the lightning that followed was not the soft, contained glow of his feathers, but a jagged, blinding lance that struck the earth and left the ground scorched. You do not need to picture the serpent in full. It is enough to know that it was vast and old, and coiled in the dark, wet places beneath the roots of the mountains. When the pressure in the sky grew too heavy, when the storms lingered too long, the serpent would rise not to the surface, but close enough that the earth trembled and the rivers swelled. It was testing the boundary, pressing against the weight of the sky. And every time it did, the Thunderbird answered. The skirmishes were brief but terrible. The Thunderbird would descend from his spire, wings beating with a fury that turned the sky black, and the lightning would strike the earth in rapid, blinding pulses. The serpent, never fully emerging, would thrash in its dark hollow, and the ground above it would heave and crack. The two ancient forces never met face to face. They did not need to. Their battle was fought through the medium of the world itself, through stone and soil and air and water. After each skirmish, the plain lay flattened and trembling. The grass pressed into the mud, the rivers swollen with water that had been shaken from the sky. But the damage was never permanent. Within days, the grass would rise again, greener than before, nourished by the rain that the battle had released. The dry riverbeds would flow clear and cold. The bison would return, and the birds would sing again. The violence of the guardian was also his gift. He did not break the world. He pruned it. The first human beings who wandered onto the plain did not understand what they were seeing. They were small, fragile things, newly shaped by hands they could not name. And when the first storm broke over their heads, they cowered in the lee of a rock and believed the world was ending. But the storm passed, as all storms do, and when they emerged into the clean, washed air and saw the grass glistening and the river flowing, they began to understand. Something immense lived above them, something that could kill them, but chose not to. They built no temples at first. They had not yet learned to shape stone or raise pillars, but they learned to look at the mountain with a reverence that was older than words. When the distant flash lit the western horizon, they stopped their work and watched. When the long, low rumble of sleeping thunder rolled across the sky, they felt something in their chests ease. The Thunderbird had become, without any covenant or command, the center of their world. The watch was eternal. Day after day, season after season, the Thunderbird kept his vigil on the granite spire, his electric blue eyes scanning the horizon and the depths below. The clouds wrapped him like a mantle. The lightning played along his feathers in slow, steady pulses. He did not age. He did not tire. He did not forget. He was the fulcrum on which the world balanced, and as long as he kept his watch, the serpent below would stay in its hollow, and the sky above would keep its rhythm, and the plain would endure. The rivers that flowed from the black hills carried the memory of the storms. They ran clear and cold in the dry seasons, fed by the rain that the Thunderbird's battles wrung from the sky. And when the serpent stirred and the pressure built, they swelled into torrents that carved new channels through the plain. The land was not static. It was a living document, rewritten each season by the wingbeats of the guardian and the thrashing of the thing below. The serpent never slept deeply. It could not. The weight of the sky pressed down on its dark hollow, and the constant, rhythmic pulse of the Thunderbird's presence was a vibration that never fully ceased. Sometimes, for reasons no creature on the surface could fathom, it would grow restless. The earth would groan. The rivers would reverse their flow. And the people, small and fragile in their camps, would feel the ground shift beneath their feet and know that the balance was being tested again. In time, the people began to answer. They had no words for the Thunderbird, no name that could hold him, but they discovered that certain sounds pleased the sky. A hollow log struck with a stick produced a deep, resonant thump that echoed the rhythm of the wingbeats. A voice raised in a low, steady chant seemed to calm the wind. They did not know why. They only knew that when the mountain flashed and the thunder rolled, they could beat their drums and sing, and the storm would pass more gently. The mountain itself became a sacred thing, not to be climbed, not to be touched. The people marked a boundary at the foothills, a ring of stones that no one crossed. To approach the Thunderbird was not death. It was something worse. It was irreverence, a violation of the order that kept the sky from falling and the serpent from rising. And so the spire remained, wrapped in its permanent crown of cloud, a place that belonged only to the architect. You do not need to picture the mountain or measure the boundary stones. It is enough to know that the feeling you get when the pressure drops and the first cool gust of wind brushes your face, that ancient, instinctive awareness that something immense is about to happen, is the same feeling the grass had. It is the same feeling the bison had. It is the oldest warning system the world ever built, and it still works. The watch was not passive. It was an active, constant negotiation between sky and deep. The Thunderbird did not merely wait for the serpent to strike. He anticipated. When the pressure in the underworld shifted, when the first faint tremor ran through the bedrock, his wings would stir, and the lightning along his feathers would brighten. The serpent would feel that brightening, and it would withdraw, not defeated, but reminded that the sky was not unguarded. At night, when the storm subsided and the clouds thinned, the people could see the distant glow of the mountain, a faint, pulsing blue that flickered against the stars. They slept under that light. They told their children that the guardian was awake, that the long, low rumble drifting across the plain was the sound of his breathing. And the children, wrapped in hides and warmed by embers, fell asleep with that sound in their ears and dreamed of wings. The landscape bore the Thunderbird's signature in ways no one yet understood. The canyons that split the plain had been carved by floods released in ancient skirmishes. The great lakes that pooled in the hollows of the hills were filled by rains that had no other source. The very shape of the world, the way the mountains rose and the rivers bent, was a record of the battle that had been fought before rain had a name, and that was still being fought, quietly, in every storm. The stories began without anyone deciding to tell them. An elder, watching a flash on the horizon, would say to a child, "He is hunting," and the child would ask, "For what?" And the elder would answer, "For the thing that would drown us if he did not." That was the first myth. Not a fiction, but a transmission of survival encoded in narrative. The stories would grow and change, but their core would remain. The sky is alive, and it watches. The Thunderbird kept his watch. The serpent kept its hollow. The plain endured its cycles of fury and renewal. And the people, still new to the world, learned to read the sky like a language. They did not yet know that the guardian would one day call one of them upward, into the cloud, into the lightning, to receive a gift that would bind humanity to the storm forever. But that day was coming. The drum had already been dreamed. It only waited for someone to strike it. Chapter 4. The Child Who Rose into the Storm. The boy had no name that anyone remembered. He was small for his age, quiet, with eyes that seemed to hold more sky than earth. When the famine came, and the bison moved beyond the horizon, and the rivers shrank to threads of dust, the people looked at their children and made choices no one wished to speak aloud. One morning, the boy woke alone. The camp was gone. The fire pit was cold, and the plain stretched empty in every direction. He did not cry. He had seen enough of hunger to know that crying cost water, and water was now more precious than anything. He walked, because there was nothing else to do. The sun crossed the sky, pale and indifferent, behind the perpetual gray haze, and the grass crunched beneath his feet, brittle with thirst. The mountain, with its crown of cloud and lightning, watched him from the west, as it watched everything, and the boy walked toward it, without knowing why. The days blurred. He ate roots and the few berries that still clung to withered bushes. He drank from a shallow seep that tasted of earth and iron. At night, he lay on his back and watched the distant flicker of the mountain, the soft, pulsing blue that the elders had always said meant the guardian was awake. He did not pray. He had never been taught the words, but he watched the light, and the light watched back, and something in his chest began to beat in rhythm with the distant glow. On the fourth day, or perhaps the fifth, he had lost count, he came to the boundary stones. The ring of weathered granite marked the edge of the sacred foothills, the place beyond which no human was permitted to walk. He knew the law. Everyone knew the law. But he was already dead in the eyes of his people, and the mountain was the only thing left in the world that still seemed alive. He stepped over the stones. The air changed immediately. It was colder, thinner, charged with the faint tang of ozone that clung to the skin. The grass gave way to bare rock and twisted pine, and the slope rose steeply before him. He climbed, his small hands finding holds in the granite, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The distant thunder was no longer distant. It rolled through the stone beneath his palms, a low, constant vibration that made his bones hum. The mountain knew he was there. You do not need to picture every step of the climb. It is enough to know that he was small and the mountain was vast. And somewhere above him, the architect of storms had turned his gaze downward. The boy felt the attention like a weight on his shoulders, not crushing, but present. The way the sky itself is present, even when you are not looking at it. He did not stop. Something was calling him upward, and for the first time since the camp had vanished, he felt less than alone. The shadow came without warning. One moment the pale gray light of the overcast sky was falling on the rocks around him. The next, everything went dark. It was not the darkness of night. It was the darkness of something immense, passing between the boy and the sun. He looked up, his heart seizing in his chest, and saw the shape that filled the entire arc of the heavens, wings that stretched from horizon to horizon, feathers the color of thunderheads, and two vast, calm eyes, the blue of contained lightning, looking directly at him. The talons descended. They were enormous, each curved claw longer than the boy's entire body, polished obsidian catching the flicker of the mountain's lightning. But they did not strike. They did not crush. They closed around him with a gentleness that seemed impossible for something so vast, a cage of dark stone that lifted him from the mountainside as easily as a mother lifts a newborn from its cradle. He was not seized. He was gathered. The world fell away. The mountain shrank to a dark spire, then a speck, then nothing at all. The plain spread out beneath him like a wrinkled hide, its rivers silver threads, its hills the faintest ripples in a sea of green and brown. The cold wind tore at his skin, but the warmth of the Thunderbird's body radiated through the talons, and the sound of the wings, slow, immense, rhythmic, was not the sharp crack of the hunt, but the deep, rolling beat of a drum that had been sounding since before the world began. They rose through the clouds. They were not the gentle, soft clouds of a summer afternoon, but the dark, towering masses of a permanent storm, shot through with veins of silver lightning that parted before the Thunderbird like curtains before a king. The boy's ears popped, and his breath came thin and quick, but he did not close his eyes. He had been abandoned by the world below. He was entering the world above, and somewhere in the heart of the storm, a nest waited that had been woven before the first rain fell. The nest was not built of twigs. It was woven from the bones of ancient storms, branches of petrified lightning, great beams of cloudwood that had never known earth, and soft linings of mist that glowed faintly in the perpetual twilight of the upper sky. It rested on a platform of compressed air and old thunder, floating above the highest peak the world had ever known, and it was large enough to hold a generation of giants. The Thunderbird set the boy down at the center of the nest with a gentleness that made the woven mist tremble. Around him, other thunderbirds, smaller than the great architect, but still vast beyond measure, turned their calm electric eyes toward the small, fragile thing that had been brought into their domain. They did not speak. They had no need for words. The language of the storm is felt, not heard, and the boy felt it in his chest, a deep, resonant thrum that welcomed him home. He slept for what felt like days, wrapped in the warm mist of the nest, nourished by something he could not name. When he awoke, the great architect was beside him. One immense wing curved overhead to shield him from the thin, sharp wind. The Thunderbird's eye, that pool of calm blue lightning, gazed down at him with an expression that held no judgment, no demand, only a quiet, patient expectation that the boy was ready to learn. The teaching began without ceremony. One of the smaller Thunderbirds, still vast enough to block the sun, produced a hollow log from the edge of the nest, worn smooth by ages of use. The bird raised a wingtip feather and struck the log once. The sound that emerged was not a thud. It was a heartbeat deep, resonant, perfectly timed to the pulse of the storm that rumbled endlessly around them. The boy felt the sound in his bones, and for the first time in his life, he understood rhythm. The Thunderbirds did not explain the drum. They let the boy discover it. They struck the log again and again, varying the tempo slow and rolling like sleeping thunder, fast and sharp like the lightning that hunted the serpent. The boy listened, his small hands resting on the woven mist, his heart learning to beat in time. After many days, or perhaps many moments, time moved strangely in the nest. He reached out and touched the hollow log himself. His first strike was hesitant, barely more than a tap, but the sound that answered was full and round, and it traveled outward from the nest in a visible ripple of silver energy that made the clouds tremble. The Thunderbirds stirred, their feathers rustling with something that might have been approval. The boy struck again, harder this time, and the rhythm that emerged was the rhythm of his own heart. The same rhythm, he realized, that the mountain had been pulsing into his chest every night as he slept, beneath the distant glow. You do not need to imagine the drum too precisely. It is enough to know that the sound it made was the first true prayer the world had ever heard. Not a request, not a plea, but in alignment. The beat of the drum, and the beat of the storm, and the beat of the boy's heart were, for that one suspended moment, the same beat. The boy had come to the sky to learn something, but what he found was that the thing he was learning had always been inside him. The drum just taught him how to let it out. The architect himself carried him back to the plain. The descent was slower than the ascent, gentler, as if the Thunderbird understood that the boy needed time to absorb what had happened. When his bare feet touched the dry, brittle grass of the famine-stricken plain, he carried a drum in his arms, a hollow log worn smooth, a stretched hide that still glowed faintly with the residual lightning of the upper sky. He was no longer the abandoned child. He was the first shaman, the first bridge between earth and storm. The Thunderbird did not linger. His great wings beat once, and the sky answered with a soft, rolling thunder that sounded almost like farewell. The mountain's crown of cloud flickered once, twice, and then settled back into its eternal watch. But the boy knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with words, that the guardian would always be watching. The drum in his hands was not a gift to keep. It was a covenant to carry. He walked back across the plain, past the boundary stones, toward a people who had abandoned him and would not recognize what he had become. He did not walk with anger. He walked with rhythm. And when he found them, starving and hollow-eyed, in their scattered camps, he sat down among them and struck the drum once, a deep, resonant pulse that echoed off the distant mountain and returned as a long, low roll of thunder. The sky answered, the people wept, and the boy who had no name began to teach the world how to listen to the storm. Chapter 5. The Battle That Gave the World Rain. The serpent did not rise in a single, sudden motion. It emerged the way a mountain rises slowly, impossibly, with a grinding of stone and a groaning of the deep earth that had held it since the world was young. The plain cracked along a seam that stretched for miles, and from that fissure came a darkness that was not smoke, but something wetter and colder. The rivers reversed their flow. The bison fled, and the first true flood the world had ever known began to pour across the grass. The water was not the clear, clean rain that the boy's drum had begun to teach the people to call. It was black and cold, and tasted of the mineral deep, and it carried with it the sound of something vast moving beneath the surface, a slow, coiling displacement that made the floodwaters bulge and swirl. The great horned serpent was not yet visible, but its presence filled the plain like a held breath, and the sky above began to darken in answer. The Thunderbird had seen the fissure open. His watch was over. The battle had begun. He descended from his granite spire, not in a dive, but in a fall, a controlled, deliberate fall that brought the entire weight of the sky down with him. His wings, still immense beyond any scale, beat once as he dropped, and the shockwave flattened the floodwaters in a circle 100 miles wide. The thunder that followed was not a sound. It was a pressure that popped ears and shattered stone and sent cracks racing through the bedrock. The world had never heard anything so loud, and it would never hear anything louder again. The serpent rose to meet him. It did not have a head in the way the Thunderbird had a head. It had a mouth, a vast circular opening, lined with teeth that spiraled inward like the throat of a whirlpool, and it had eyes, pale and lidless, scattered across its body like drowned moons. Its scales were the color of wet slate and the deepest water, and they dripped with the black flood that still poured from the fissure. It was not evil. It was old, and it was hungry, and it had been waiting in the dark for longer than the sky had been alive. You do not need to picture the collision in detail. It is enough to know that when the Thunderbird struck the serpent, the sound was not of flesh on flesh, but of two fundamental forces meeting the way lightning meets the sea, the way a mountain meets a rising tide. The sky screamed. The earth buckled, and the lightning that had always been contained within the Thunderbird's feathers now erupted outward in a single, continuous bolt that connected the heavens to the deep. The lightning struck the serpent's body and did not stop. It held a jagged, blinding column of blue-white fire that pinned the creature to the fissure like a spear. The serpent thrashed, and each thrash sent a wave of black water surging across the plain. But the Thunderbird's wings beat down again, and the shock wave drove the flood back, pressing it flat against the earth. The battle was not a contest of strength. It was a negotiation of pressure, and the sky was winning. The rain began not as a mercy, but as a wound. The sky, torn open by the continuous lightning and the force of the wingbeats, began to bleed water. It fell in sheets, not the gentle rain that the drum would one day call, but a violent, drowning torrent that mixed with the black flood and began, very slowly, to dilute it. The clear water of the heavens poured into the dark water of the deep, and the two became one. The first rain was not a gift. It was a byproduct of violence, but it was also the beginning of everything the world would become. The serpent felt the rain, and it recoiled. Not from pain, it did not feel pain in any way the living would recognize, but from the dilution, the mixing, the contamination of its ancient darkness with the bright water of the sky. It began to withdraw, its coils sliding back into the fissure, its pale eyes closing one by one. The Thunderbird did not pursue. He had no need. The serpent was not an enemy to be destroyed. It was a weight to be balanced, and the balance had been restored. The withdrawal took hours, or perhaps days. Time had lost all meaning on the plain. When the last coil vanished into the fissure, the earth closed over it with a sound like a door being sealed. The black water stopped pouring. The flood began to recede, drawn back into the deep, or absorbed by the soil, or lifted into the sky by the Thunderbird's still beating wings. The plain lay drenched and steaming. The grass flattened, the rivers swollen and carving new channels. And the rain continued to fall, softer now, gentler, as if the sky had learned something from the violence and was beginning, very slowly, to forgive itself. The Thunderbird settled onto a low hill that had been an island in the flood, his immense wings folding against his body, his lightning dimmed to the faintest blue glow. He was not wounded. Nothing in the world could wound him, but he was weary in the way that mountains are weary after an age of standing. He looked out across the plain, his electric eyes tracing the paths of the new rivers, the pools of clean water that were already beginning to reflect the clearing sky. The battle was over. The rain was falling, and the world, for the first time, was being watered. The people had fled to the highest ground they could find, rocky outcrops and the lower slopes of the sacred foothills, beyond the boundary stones that no longer seemed to matter. They had watched the battle from a distance, small and huddled and utterly helpless, and what they had seen would become the foundation of every story they would ever tell. The sky descending, the earth splitting, the water rising, and then, impossibly, being driven back by wings that spanned the world. When the rain softened and the flood receded, they did not immediately descend. They waited, watching the great dark shape of the Thunderbird settle on his island hill, watching the lightning dim along his feathers, watching the sky begin to clear. The fear was still in them, a deep, bone-level terror that would take generations to fade. But it was mingled now with something else. Gratitude, awe, the dawning recognition that the thing they had feared was also the thing that had saved them. The first of them to walk back onto the plain was an elder, the same woman who had placed her hand over her heart at the distant flash, who had first taught the people to read the mountain's signs. She walked slowly, her bare feet pressing into the drenched earth, and when she reached the place where the fissure had opened and closed, she knelt. The ground was warm and smooth, sealed by the pressure of the serpent's withdrawal, and already the grass was beginning to push through the mud. You do not need to imagine the devastation too clearly. It is enough to know that the plain was changed. New rivers carving channels where none had been. New pools of clear water reflecting the pale gold light of the clearing sky. New hills of displaced stone that would become sacred places in the generations to come. The flood had scoured the land, but the rain had washed it clean, and the Thunderbird's wingbeats had pressed the soil firm. The world had been broken open and sealed again, and it was more fertile than it had ever been. The boy with the drum came down from the foothills with the others, still carrying the hollow log against his chest. He did not strike it, not yet. There was too much to absorb, too much to understand. But as he walked across the transformed plain, he noticed that the drum was humming a faint, continuous vibration that matched the distant pulse of the Thunderbird's resting wings. The drum knew the battle was over. It was already beginning to learn the new rhythm of the world. The Thunderbird remained on his island hill for 7 days and 7 nights, though no one at the time counted them. The people kept their distance, watching from the edges of the plain, building small fires and speaking in low voices. They did not drum. They did not sing. They waited, understanding, without being told, that the guardian needed stillness, that the great architect was restoring himself, that the balance of the world was settling back into place, like a bone being set after a fracture. On the morning of the 8th day, the Thunderbird rose, his wings spread slowly, still immense, still capable of flattening the world, but the motion was gentle now, the gesture of a creature returning to its watch rather than descending to battle. He lifted from the island hill and flew, unhurried, toward the sacred mountain that had always been his home. The people watched him go, and the elder who had knelt in the mud raised her hand, not in farewell, but in acknowledgement. The guardian was returning to his spire. The storm was over. The watch would continue. The rain that fell after the battle was different from the rain that had fallen during it. It was gentle and steady, a soft gray veil that hung over the plain for days, soaking into the soil, filling the new rivers, waking seeds that had lain dormant since the world began. The people learned to stand in it, to let it wash over them, to understand that water from the sky was not a punishment, but a gift. The drum taught them this. When the boy finally struck it again, the rhythm was soft and rolling, and the rain seemed to fall in time. The serpent was not dead. The people knew this, just as they knew that the Thunderbird was not a savior, but a guardian, and that guardianship required an enemy to guard against. The fissure had sealed, but deep beneath the plain, in the dark hollows where stone turned to fire, the ancient coils still rested. The serpent would stir again, in another age, in another flood, and the Thunderbird would answer again, and the world would be watered again by the violence of their meeting. This was not a tragedy. It was a cycle, and cycles are the way the world endures. The boy who had no name would become the first drum keeper, the first bridge between the sky and the people, and his drum would teach generations the rhythm of the storm. But that was still to come. For now, there was only the plain, drenched and steaming under a clearing sky, and the distant mountain wrapped in its crown of soft blue light, and the sound of the first gentle rain falling on the grass. The battle had given the world water. The Thunderbird had returned to his watch, and the people, still small and fragile and new, had begun to understand that the storm was not something to fear. It was something to listen to, and the drum would teach them how. Chapter 6. The First Drum and the Promise of Thunder. The plain did not forget the flood, but it forgave it. The waters receded slowly over days that blurred into weeks, leaving behind soil richer and darker than any that had come before. New grass pushed through the mud, pale green at first, then deepening to the silver green the world had always known. The rivers, carved into new channels by the serpent's thrashing and the Thunderbird's wingbeats, ran clear and cold from the mountains to the horizon. The land was scarred, but it was alive. The boy with the drum walked among the people as they returned to the plain, his bare feet pressing into the wet earth, the hollow log still cradled against his chest. He did not speak of what he had seen in the nest above the clouds. He did not need to. The drum hummed with a faint, continuous vibration that anyone could feel by touching its surface, and the rhythm it carried was the same rhythm that had driven back the flood. The people looked at the boy differently now. He was no longer the abandoned child. He was something they did not yet have a word for. When he struck the drum for the first time among them, the sound rolled outward across the wet plain and returned as a soft echo from the distant mountain. The people fell silent. The rhythm was slow and steady, not the sharp crack of the hunt or the furious beat of the battle, but something gentler, a heartbeat, a breath, a promise. And as the drum spoke, the sky answered. A soft, gray veil of rain began to fall. Not the violent torrent of the serpent's defeat, but a gentle, steady water that soaked into the soil and woke the seeds that had been waiting since the world began. The elder who had knelt at the sealed fissure became the first to teach what she had learned. She showed the people how to lift their faces to the rain, how to let it wash over them without fear, how to understand that the water falling from the sky was not a punishment, but a covenant. She had placed her palm on the wound where the serpent had withdrawn, and she had felt the warmth of the healing earth. She knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with words, that the guardian on the mountain had not saved them out of obligation. He had saved them because the balance required it, and they were part of the balance now. The first drum circle formed without anyone deciding to form it. One evening, as the sun set behind the sacred mountain, and the soft blue glow of the Thunderbird's crown began to pulse against the darkening sky, the boy began to beat the drum. Others gathered, drawn by the rhythm. And they brought their own hollow logs and stretched hides, instruments they had not known how to make until the boy showed them. The sound that rose from that circle was not music in any sense the world would later understand. It was alignment. It was the heartbeat of a people learning to beat in time with the sky. You do not need to picture every face in that circle, or count the drums as they multiplied. It is enough to know that the fear began to fade when the distant flash lit the western horizon. The people no longer cowered. They paused, they listened, and they felt the drumbeat in their chests. The same rhythm the mountain had been sending them since before they were born. The Thunderbird was not a monster to be appeased. He was a guardian to be honored, and the drum was the language in which that honor was spoken. The boy grew, as boys do, and the drum grew with him. He taught others how to strike the hollow log, so that it spoke in the voice of sleeping thunder, how to beat the stretched hide, so that it called the gentle rain. He did not claim authority. He did not name himself a leader, but the people brought him their sick and their frightened, their questions and their doubts, and he answered each one with a rhythm. The drum had become more than an instrument. It was a bridge between the earth and the sky, and the boy who had no name was its first keeper. The Thunderbird watched from his spire, his electric blue eyes tracing the movements of the tiny figures on the plain below. His storms were gentler now, seasonal rains that came when the drum called, and receded when the earth had drunk its fill. The cataclysmic fury of the battle had passed, replaced by a steady, patient vigilance. He was not resting, he was waiting, as he had always waited, for the serpent to stir again. But the stirring was distant now, and the world was learning to live in the rhythm he had set. The architect was content. The plain transformed into a garden. The flood had scoured the land, but the rain had washed it clean, and the seeds that had lain dormant through the long dry age now burst into bloom. Flowers of pale blue and gold opened their petals to the sky. The bison returned, their herds larger and healthier than before. The rivers teemed with fish, and the people, still small and fragile against the vastness of the world, began to build something that would one day be called a home. They built it around the drum. They built it around the sound of the sky. The drum never stopped beating. It passed from a boy to a young woman who had watched him strike it when she was a child, who had felt the rhythm settle into her bones and refused to let it go. She learned the slow, rolling beat that called the gentle rain, and the sharp, quick rhythm that honored the lightner's hunt. And when the boy, who was no longer a boy, placed the drum in her hands for the first time, the mountain flickered with a soft, approving glow. The bloodline was not of flesh, but of spirit. It was the lineage of listeners, and it would stretch forward through every generation that followed. The elder who had knelt at the sealed fissure did not live to see the garden the plain became, but she died with her hand over her heart, and the distant flicker of the mountain's blue light falling across her face. The people wrapped her in hides and laid her in the earth near the place where the serpent had withdrawn, and the young woman who now kept the drum struck it softly as the soil was pressed down. The rhythm was not mournful. It was the steady, rolling beat of a world that continued. The drum became the center of everything. It called the planting rains in spring, when the seeds needed softening, and the harvest pauses in autumn, when the sky was asked to hold its breath. It honored births, its deep pulse welcoming new hearts into the rhythm of the world. It eased deaths, its gentle beat guiding the departing back toward the sky from which the first drum had come. The people no longer feared the storm because they had learned to speak its language. The young drum keeper grew old, and her hands learned rhythms the boy had never taught her, rhythms that came to her in dreams, whispered by the flicker of the mountain against her closed eyelids. She taught these rhythms to a child, and that child taught another, and the lineage stretched forward like a river, finding its way to the sea. No single keeper was greater than another. They were links in a chain of listening, and the chain was unbroken. The serpent slept, but it did not die. Every few generations, the earth would tremble, and the rivers would swell, and the old fear would rise again in the hearts of the people. But the drum keeper would ascend the foothills, alone, and strike the drum in the rhythm of the battle, sharp and fierce, a reminder to the deep that the sky was still guarded. The serpent would subside, and the waters would recede, and the people would remember that the covenant was not a promise of safety. It was a promise of balance. You do not need to remember every name or count every generation of drum keepers. It is enough to know that the sound has never stopped. The same rhythm that the boy struck on the plain after the first rain is still beating somewhere in the world, in the drum at a ceremony, in the heart of a listener standing beneath a darkening sky, in the low, distant roll of thunder that makes you pause for just a moment and remember that you are not separate from the storm. The Thunderbird kept his watch through all of it. His great form remained on the granite spire, wrapped in cloud and soft lightning, his electric blue eyes tracing the movements of the tiny figures below. He did not age. He did not tire. He did not intervene in the daily lives of the people because he did not need to. The drum was his voice among them now, and as long as it beat in the rhythm he had taught, the balance would hold. The boundary stones at the foothills weathered and sank into the earth, but no one forgot where they had been. The mountain remained sacred, a place of pilgrimage rather than prohibition, where the drum keepers would go to feel the pulse of the stone and listen for the low, constant hum of the guardian's wings. They did not climb to the spire. No human ever would. But they stood at the edge of the forbidden and felt themselves small, and that smallness was its own kind of prayer. The stories grew and changed, as stories do. The boy who had no name became a legend, and the legend became a teaching, and the teaching became a truth that no one questioned. Children were told of the great battle before they could walk, of the sky tearing open and the rain falling from the wound, of the drum that echoed the heartbeat of the storm. They grew up knowing that they were not the masters of the world, but its partners, and that the sky was not empty. It was alive, and it was listening. In the quiet of a summer evening, when the heat lightning flickered on the horizon, and the long, low rumble of sleeping thunder rolled across the plain, an elder might say to a child, "He is dreaming," and the child would ask, "Of what?" And the elder would answer, "Of you, of all of us, of the day when the serpent wakes, and the battle comes again, and the drum must be ready." The child would listen to the thunder and feel, for the first time, the rhythm stirring in their own chest, the inheritance of a lineage older than memory. The drum waited, the mountain watched, the serpent slept, and the plain, watered by the first rain and every rain that followed, grew greener with each passing season, a living testament to the covenant made in violence and sealed in water. The people scattered across the vast grassland, carrying their drums and their stories, but they never forgot the spire wrapped in cloud, the blue eyes that watched from above, or the rhythm that held the world together. The Thunderbird's storm had become their music, and the music would carry them forward through every dry season and every flood, all the way to the age of memory, where the story would wait for those who still knew how to listen. Chapter 7. The Storm That Never Fell Silent. The story of the Thunderbird did not end when the first drum fell silent, or the last elder who remembered the battle closed her eyes. It simply changed shape, the way a storm changes shape as it moves across the plain, from a towering black anvil to a soft gray veil of rain, from a jagged bolt of lightning to the low, distant rumble that makes a child look up from their play and wonder what the sky is saying. The people who first told this story did not think of it as mythology. They did not have a word for mythology. They had a word for truth, and the truth was that the thunder had a heartbeat, and the lightning had a purpose, and the rain that fell on their fields was a gift purchased by wings that had beaten back the flood. This was not a belief they chose. It was a reality they inherited, as real and as urgent as the weather itself. You do not need to travel to the Black Hills or stand at the edge of the boundary stones to understand what they understood. You have felt it yourself. When the pressure drops and the air grows heavy, when the first cool gust of wind brushes your face, and the distant flicker of heat lightning traces the horizon, something ancient stirs in your chest. It is the same thing that stirred in the grass, in the bison, in the boy who walked toward the mountain with nothing but a hollow log and a heart beating in time with the sky. The meteorologists who now track the great storms of the Great Plains with satellites and Doppler radar are describing the same thing the elders described around their fires. The supercell thunderstorms that spawn tornadoes and drop hail the size of stones are born in the same conditions the Thunderbird represented. The collision of warm, wet air from the low places with cold, dry air from the heights. The science names the forces. The myth named the meaning. The Black Hills still rise from the plains of what is now called South Dakota, their granite spires catching the lightning more often than any other place in the region. Scientists will tell you this is because of the elevation and the meeting of air masses. The Lakota, who have lived in the shadow of those hills for thousands of years, will tell you it is because the Wakinyang still keep their watch. Both explanations are true. They are true in different languages, but they describe the same sacred reality. The drum did not vanish when the first European settlers crossed the plains. It was suppressed, silenced, driven underground by policies designed to erase the cultures that had carried it. But the rhythm could not be erased. It survived in secret ceremonies, in whispered songs, in the hands of elders who passed it to children too young to be suspected. And today, in powwows and ceremonies, and the quiet resurgence of traditions that were never truly lost, the drum still beats. The heart of the storm still speaks. The iconography of the Thunderbird has traveled even farther than the drum. It appears on totem poles in the Pacific Northwest, its wings spread wide, its eyes fierce with contained lightning. It adorns the regalia of plains nations, beaded into geometric patterns that echo the lightning's jagged path. It has entered the visual language of modern cinema and digital art, its silhouette recognizable to millions who have never heard the story of the boy or the serpent or the first rain. The image endures. The meaning waits to be rediscovered. The serpent sleeps, as it has always slept, beneath the bedrock of our understanding. We have given it new names: climate disruption, extreme weather, the rising oceans that threaten to swallow the low places. The old story knew that the battle between sky and deep was not a one-time event, but a cycle, and that the guardian could drive back the flood, but never destroy it permanently. We are living in an age when the flood is rising again, and the question the old story asks is not whether the Thunderbird will answer. The question is whether we have remembered how to beat the drum. You do not need to believe in the Thunderbird as a literal being to understand what the story means. The story means that the world is not a machine, and the weather is not an accident. It means that the forces that water the earth and the forces that threaten to drown it are locked in an ancient negotiation, and that human beings are not spectators to that negotiation. We are participants, whether we know it or not. The drum gave us a voice in the conversation. The question is whether we will use it. The boy who had no name walked across a famine-stricken plain toward a mountain he had been taught was forbidden, carrying nothing but the rhythm of his own heart. He did not know what he was doing. He did not know that his feet were tracing a path that would be followed by every drumkeeper who came after him. He only knew that the sky was alive, and the mountain was calling, and something in his chest was beating in time with the distant blue glow. That was enough. It is still enough. The archaeological record holds its own quiet testimony. Across the Great Plains and the Great Lakes, ancient effigy mounds shaped like enormous birds with outstretched wings lie pressed into the earth, their outlines visible from the sky. The oldest of these predate any written record, their builders unknown, their purpose a matter of scholarly debate. But the indigenous nations who still live on those lands do not debate. They know what the mounds represent. They have always known. In the Black Hills, on rock faces sheltered by pine and thyme, petroglyphs depict great birds with zigzag lines radiating from their wings, the ancient shorthand for lightning. These carvings are not decorations. They're testimony. They mark places where the veil between the sky and the human world was understood to be thin, where the drum was played and the storm was honored and the covenant was renewed. The stone remembers what the conquerors tried to forget. The symbolic truth of the Thunderbird has never been difficult to grasp, though it has often been dismissed. The creature is the storm made sacred, the recognition that the forces that water the earth are not blind mechanics, but expressions of a living, breathing order. To the cultures that first told this story, there was no separation between the physical and the spiritual. The thunder was a voice. The lightning was a gaze. The rain was a gift. This was not poetry. It was ecology, ethics, and theology woven into a single, seamless garment. We who live in an age of satellites and forecasts have gained much. We can predict the path of a hurricane days in advance. We can measure the voltage of a lightning strike and the decibel level of thunder. But we have lost something too. The sense that the weather is not merely something that happens to us, but something we are in relationship with. The old story offers not a rejection of science, but a complement to it. The science tells us how the storm works. The myth tells us what the storm means. The modern legacy of the Thunderbird is not confined to museums and anthropology textbooks. It lives in the ceremonies of the Lakota, the Ojibwe, the Menominee, and dozens of other nations who still drum the ancient rhythms and still tell the story of the boy who was taken to the sky. It lives in the work of indigenous environmental advocates who invoke the Thunderbird as a symbol of nature's power and the sacred duty to protect the balance. And it lives, quietly, in the chest of anyone who has ever stopped to watch a storm roll in and felt, just for a moment, that they were in the presence of something immense and alive. You do not need to adopt the beliefs of any particular culture to receive what the story offers. The story offers a way of seeing, a lens through which the world appears not as a collection of dead objects moved by impersonal forces, but as a community of living presences, each with its role, each with its voice. The thunder speaks, the lightning watches, the rain nourishes, and human beings, small and fragile as they are, have been given a drum to beat in answer. The boy who walked toward the mountain did not know that his footsteps would echo across millennia. He did not know that the rhythm he discovered in a nest above the clouds would become the heartbeat of nations. He only knew that he had been abandoned by the world below and gathered by the world above, and that the drum in his hands hummed with a vibration that felt like home. That is the essence of every true calling. Not a grand strategy, but a quiet response to a presence that was already there, waiting to be acknowledged. The serpent still sleeps. The storms still roll across the plains. And the lightning still strikes the Black Hills more often than anywhere else in the region. And the drum still beats in ceremonies that were driven underground, but never extinguished. The covenant holds. It has been bent by centuries of violence and erasure, but it has not been broken. The Thunderbird keeps his watch, and the people who remember how to listen keep their part of the bargain. The rest of us are invited to learn. When the wind rises and the sky darkens and the first low rumble of thunder reaches your ears, there is no need to be afraid. The old story tells you what that sound is. It is not the random collision of air masses. It is the heartbeat of a guardian who has been watching over this world since before the first rain fell. And if you feel something stir in your chest in answer, a quickening, a recognition, a rhythm that matches the distant roll that is the drum, it has always been there. It is the oldest inheritance you possess. So let the storm come. Let the rain fall. Let the thunder roll across the plain, and the lightning flicker on the horizon, and the wind press the grass flat against the earth. The architect of the atmosphere still keeps his watch on a spire of granite and cloud. The serpent still dreams in its dark hollow, and somewhere, in a quiet place that may be very near or very far, a drum is beating slow and steady, a heartbeat, a promise, the first prayer the world ever learned. It is still sounding, and if you listen, even now, you can hear it. It is the storm that struck before the first rain, and it has never stopped speaking.